Welcome to Golden Moments today. Today I have another story from this book I read one on the last program, and this is also a story about a little girl. And I think you'll like it. And it's by Miss Kuhlman. The stamp was upside down. The printing, that of a very young child, was done in pencil. All that was on the envelope was, "The Preacher Lady, Pittsburgh." I knew immediately that no child's mother would have permitted the letter to go through the mail had she seen the envelope. The note inside had been written by a little girl, and was short and to the point. She asked that I please pray that God would make her daddy and mommy not drink, and then she invited me to their home for Christmas. The letter was signed Audrey, and that's all there was, except the postscript, which read, "I forgot to tell you where we live. You get off the bus, and our house is the third big white house from the corner." I was so amused by both the letter and the envelope that next morning I read it on my radio broadcast, describing the envelope and the child's printing efforts. As I read the entire note, including the postscript, I little knew that Ann Dolan, the child's mother, happened at that exact time to be listening at home to her radio. As she told me later, she was shocked speechless as she heard the words of the postscript came over the air. "You get off the bus, and our house is the third big white house on the corner." Anne remembered now how 2 days before her young daughter had been struggling with the dictionary, and then in desperation had innocently asked her mother how to spell "preacher lady." "Why do you want to know?" her mother asked. "Oh, just 'cause," had come the reply. Panic-stricken, Anne rushed to Audrey's school to meet the child at dismissal time. As Audrey emerged, her mother confronted her with the question uppermost in her mind. "Did you invite Miss Kuhlman to our house for Christmas?" The child never flinched. Looking at her mother straight in the eye, she replied, "Yes." Half hysterically, her mother asked, "What on earth do you expect to do with her when she comes?" In firm tones came the answer, "Play with her, of course." In that precious little child's mind there was something far deeper than wanting to just play with the preacher lady. What that little girl really wanted most was a Christian mama and daddy. Oh, she loved Grandma. She loved her deeply as any little girl could possibly love her grandmother. But somehow, no matter how wonderful the grandmother is, she can never take the place of a mother and daddy. Little Audrey had been largely raised by her grandmother, for her mother had been so busy with other things. Her social life took so much of her time. She was just too busy to take care of a little girl. Besides, what can you do with a little girl in a cocktail lounge? Then there was her daddy. Of course, he loved little Audrey, loved her dearly, but you just don't take little girls to the sportsman's club. And what can you do with a little girl when the mother and daddy aren't home most of the time? Then came the day that Audrey heard me make the announcement over the radio that the Thanksgiving service was to be held at Syria Mosque. With her hopes high, she asked her mother to take her. Anne had never heard of Catherine Kuhlman, and she could not have cared less. But finally, to pacificate the child, she agreed to take her. Audrey was sick before Thanksgiving. Leaving the child with her grandmother, Anne was gone from home for 3 days. But in her heart, she loved her little girl. She had left her sick and had made her a promise, which was a reason which she could not fathom, seemed to mean a lot to the child. And so she returned home early Thanksgiving morning in time to take Audrey to the service. Nothing happened, as Anne expressed it in her own words. Apparently I wasn't touched. I thought the whole thing was silly. My idea of life was to live it up, to have fun. I had spent 20 years of my life in the same crowd, and this was their idea too. But in view of what happened later, she continued, I think that afternoon I came under conviction, although I certainly didn't know it at the time. Then came the Christmas season. The letter with the stamp upside down, the invitation to the big white house, the third from the corner. When I did not make an appearance at the big white house for Christmas, Audrey repeatedly begged her mother to take her to the New Year's Eve candlelight service. For several days the child's plea fell on totally deaf ears. Then New Year's in a religious service? Not a chance. Besides, recalled Anne, I had a big engagement in New York at the Stork Club for that night. I had made the date the preceding August, and I had no intention of disappointing these people at their big New Year's Eve party. I had already sent my clothes on to New York. Nothing was going to stop me. And then she continued, Audrey asked me again, for at least the 20th time. And to this day I do not know what happened. It certainly must have been the Lord working, for all of a sudden I called New York and canceled my long-standing reservation, and instead made reservations on one of the chartered buses going to the New Year's Eve candlelight service. With a smile, Anne continued almost triumphantly, I dare say my reservation was the only cancellation at the Stork Club that New Year's Eve. The weather was very bad that New Year's Eve afternoon. It was blowing hard, the streets were icy, and many people were already snowbound. The taxi was unable to make it up the hill to the Dolan's house, so Anne trudged down the hill in the snow with 7-year-old Audrey scuffing ecstatically beside her, her little heart pounding harder than it had ever pounded before, and her little body vibrating with enthusiasm and expectation. They got to the bus just in time. This New Year's Eve was assuredly different from any other that Anne had ever spent, and it was to prove the most momentous in her life, for that night she gave her heart to the Lord, and her life was forever changed. I wish I could stand on the highest mountain and proclaim to the whole world the glorious experience of being born again, Anne exclaimed with tears of joy welling up in her dark eyes. But it is something that one must experience. It is not something you can fully explain to another. One thing I know, he gives a new life through the new birth. Christ did not explain the how to Nicodemus. The process is a mystery as seen in John 3:8. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. So is every one that is born of the Spirit. Though its causes are hidden, its effects are manifest. The Lord works mysteriously, but his results are definite. I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto myself. And when, bound to his cross, he is lifted up before men's eyes by some strange power which defies analysis, dying he brings them life, bound he brings them liberty, suffering he redeems them from the greatest anguish the soul can know, the agony of hopeless despair, the everlasting and everlastingly loving, he challenges them and claims them, and will never let them go until he makes them his forever. When little Audrey's daddy, Red Dolan, came in from a party at his club around 8 a.m., he brought trinkets and noisemakers for his young daughter, the sort of thing that had always before thrilled her. But Audrey didn't care about any noisemakers on this day. It was as if she had already gotten what she wanted from the Lord. But it was to be another year before she got all she wanted from him, for it took that long for her father to accept Christ. However, during that year, another member of the Dolan family was to be marvelously touched and healed by the power of God, Grandpa. Anne's father had been a drunkard for 60 years. I never remember my dad sober, said Anne. He was a musician and would often stay away from home 3 or 4 weeks at a time. Upon coming home, he would frequently be so sick that he would lie out on the lawn in front of the house, unable to move. After each such time, it seemed to take longer to sober him up. Before Anne and Red were married, Red had tried to remedy the situation, but Grandpa could not or would not change his ways. Every doctor in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, now knew him, loved him, and tried to help him. Their verdict was unanimous. Something had to be done for Grandpa. A few months after Anne's conversion, Grandpa engaged in what was to prove his last bout with liquor. He had been drinking heavily for weeks. The last time anyone had seen him, he looked a typical bum. One boot over one shoe, no shoelaces, someone's filthy, dirty cap on his head, and he had lost his glasses so he couldn't see. He was by now so drunk that his trousers wouldn't stay up, and he had taken an old piece of rope to hold him in place. Grandma, looking for him, came down and said to Anne, I think Dad's just about done. I haven't seen him for 5 whole days. He was so miserable when he left the house, I'm afraid he may have done away with himself. He hasn't eaten for days, just drinking all the time. This was a Saturday night, and Anne replied, I will be going to Miss Kuhlman's service tomorrow. Don't worry, Mother. We'll pray for Dad. You just stay home and pray for him, too. The next night and the next, Dad still hadn't come home. The third night, Anne's mother came down and said, "I think Dad is in the barn." They searched carefully all over the barn, but could find no trace of Grandpa. It was by now 9 o'clock at night. Anne and Audrey started home, praying along the way. Suddenly Audrey said, "I hear something coming down the road." Anne recognized the sound of her father's footsteps, that curious dragging sound which meant he was too weak to pick up his feet. And then he appeared around the bend of the road. Grandpa didn't seem to know either his daughter or granddaughter, but Audrey went over to him there in the middle of the road and said, "Grandpa, I love you, and you don't know how much Jesus loves you." The man was so sick he couldn't stand. All he wanted was money for a drink. Then Anne said, "Dad, just let's kneel down here." They all knelt together on the side of the road, and Anne prayed very simply, "Lord, take him. Whatever you want, whatever way you want him, just take him." In that instant, Grandpa got up from his knees, walked straight up the hill with amazing strength, entered the house, took off his clothes, and bathed and shaved. Christ had come into his heart, and Grandpa was a new creature in Christ Jesus. Old things having passed away, behold, all things had become new. 2 days later found Grandpa at the service in Carnegie Hall, publicly acknowledging Christ as his Savior. He was never again to take or even want another drink. Meanwhile, Red Dolan was fighting his own conviction. Months had now passed since Anne and then her father's conversion. Red thought it a wonderful thing that his wife had given her heart to the Lord. Wonderful for her, that is, but this sort of thing was definitely not for him. God always hears little girls' prayers. And then it happened. One day, standing at the end of a bar, having ordered his drink but never having touched it, something happened to Red Dolan that to this hour he cannot fully explain. And yet it was the most powerful force that had ever seized his person. He suddenly saw himself as God saw him, a sinner, wretched and miserable offender against God, a man not worthy of a precious little girl's pure love, a man who needed to be cleansed from all unrighteousness and needing to be delivered from the power of sin. Involuntarily he dropped to his knees at the end of the bar, and in a bar room filled with men he cried out unashamedly, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." That was all. It was a short prayer, but it came from a sincere and penitent heart. It came from the heart of a man who was sick of sin, a man who wanted to be freed from the power of sin, a man who wanted the reality of Christ in his life, the experience that his little girl had, and the reality of the person of Jesus as reflected in the life of Anne. He had seen what that experience had done in the life of Grandpa, and he knew it was real. He swears there was no more to his prayer than that. But in that moment, the greatest miracle a human being can know took place. Red became a new creature in Christ Jesus and was instantly, completely, and permanently delivered from liquor. The Dolans have a new home, a Christian home, which they enjoy together. Audrey has new parents, their lives dedicated to Christ. With 2 years as a student at Carnegie Institute of Technology, Audrey's faith is as secure, as solid, as sound, and as simple as when she put the stamp on the envelope upside down and wrote her first letter to the preacher lady. This is God, that in the balcony of an auditorium a woman gave herself to the Lord, that at the end of a country road her father accepted him, that in a crowded bar her husband gave him his heart, and all because a little girl prayed for Jesus' sake. I hope you've enjoyed that story, and we'll ask Mr. Morgan to read now.
Mr. Morgan got a big job on his hands, but I only got about 12 minutes to do the job. You can't expect anything outstanding in a few minutes, but we only have about 15 minutes each in our program. And we got to make the best of it. Well, mine is the same gospel that I read the last time, and I can't seem to get away from it. Anyway, the big order is to go with the gospel, to take the gospel, to send the gospel. We sing a song, "Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore." Years ago, when I was first saved, it was great missionary conventions. It would stir you up. You'd like to get out into the foreign lands and preach the gospel. And today it seems like we got television is the place to get, not out where there's no television. We all like to get big Mr. Television preachers. Here I am. I'm a little one. But here it says, he that believeth and is baptized. Now that means you got to have the power of God floating through you, really baptized in the Spirit, and shall be saved. But he that believeth not shall be, oh, I don't like that word. I don't think I'll say it. But if you're not a believer, I feel sorry for unbelievers. But believers, it'll tickle again, and these signs shall follow them that believe. God maketh good believers, believing with our heart and confessing with our mouth that Jesus is the Christ. And in my name shall they cast out devils. What a job to do. Cast out devils. I had an experience in Kenya, making an altar call, and there was a line-up of people coming, and the first one that flopped right down on the ground in a heap. I never touched her, never said a word, never said a thing. He fell in a heap in front of me. And that's not one of my ministries, having people fall down in front of me, but she did. And a few days after, the preacher, the pastor, said, you know that woman that fell down? She said she was delivered of a demon. I didn't know, I had no discernment, no nothing. I don't know if she fell, but she was telling the pastor that right then the demon left her. So we can cast out devils and not know it. That's the way to put that. They shall cast out devils. People really get tested with those devils. And they come in different forms and fashions. And anyway, I can say that was one that I had seemed to have nothing to do with, but he left her. So they shall cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. Well, there's people being fanatical at that. I've heard of that, people practicing that. But nevertheless, if a serpent bites you, like the one bit St. Paul on the Isle of Miletus, wherever it was, and he shook it off and felt no harm. So it made the natives say, well, this man really is of God. They were dumbfounded when he shook the thing off where he should have fallen down dead. So we certainly have it in the Scriptures that nothing can by any means hurt you. You're under a divine command, a divine protection when you're out ministering the gospel. You're under such a well-guarded person when you're out with the gospel. It's the most wonderful thing a man ever did, to take this gospel into foreign lands. Boy, the experiences is unbelievable how well you looked after, how interested God is in you. And he has all power, and he has legions of angels to assign to your well-being. It is great. So I say, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. If you can get in anywhere, get going, and do it if you can. And they shall if they drink any deadly thing. I was standing on a corner once in India, and a big old truck would come along, and a cloud of dust would rise, just strung your nose almost. And then you'd see somebody walking along with a big old sore around his neck, or spitting out, and you know that germs was just flying up into your nostrils. And I'd say, I'll inhale any deadly thing and it shall not hurt me. I took that as like you take drinking anything. You drink in that disease dust right down in your lungs. So I claimed the victory. And I got it, for sure I did. They shall inhale any deadly germ, and it shall not hurt them. And they shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Well, we've had sick healed without touching them, without praying for them. So the white woman entered the house. She come out to the meeting and shouting. Soon as the white woman come in through my door, I was healed. We never prayed for her, never. Well, not personally, but just the appearance of us coming into the house, the woman was healed. She had some kind of back trouble, I think it was, that left her an invalid almost. And as soon as this white woman entered into the door, she was completely healed. Now, it's nice to go with the gospel, and you got the healing power right with you.